I stood there in the hallway, the echo of my heels swallowed by the silence of an office that used to be mine. Through the glass, my daughter sat behind my desk, her name on the door, her lies in the drawer, and my legacy under her heels. After 30 years of building this company from scratch, after losing my husband and keeping it alive alone, I wasn't the owner. I wasn't even the mother. I was just the woman she had forged out of existence. Wait. Before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun bled through the blinds of Diane Mercer's office, striping her mahogany desk in sharp bands of gold. In the center lay a stack of papers, crisp, official, carrying her name in a curling scrawl she instantly recognized but knew she had not written. Her signature had always been her armor, the mark of every deal, every check, every founding contract. Yet here it was, hijacked, twisted and abused. She adjusted her glasses, heart drumming against her ribs as she turned one page, then another. Each signature looked like hers, but not hers. It felt like staring into a mirror warped just enough to unsettle. The door opened without a knock. Claire swept in, perfume sharp as citrus, her heels announcing her arrival in sharp, defiant clicks. Behind her drifted Ryan, his hands buried in his pockets, a smug grin playing on his lips like he was already savoring someone else's victory. "It's time for new leadership," Claire announced, sliding her tote onto a chair as though the space were already hers. "The business needs my name, not yours. People want energy, vision, someone who can take Mercer Office Supply into the future." Ryan leaned on the doorframe, a lazy accessory to her ambition. "Investors want young blood," he added, his smirk widening. Diane's grip on the papers tightened. The silence she gave them wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Fury coiled in her chest, but she refused to feed it to them. From the corner, Marta Lopez spoke, her voice carrying the weight of decades of friendship and numbers. She had been Diane's accountant, now retired, but still sharp-eyed and loyal. Her gaze skimmed the documents, then settled on Claire with quiet disbelief. "She's not just replacing you," Marta said softly. "She's stealing you." Diane let the words hang in the room. She had built Mercer Office Supply with her late husband, brick by brick, catalog by catalog. Every invoice, every vendor call, every sleepless night had her fingerprints on it. To have Claire stand here, dripping entitlement, was more than defiance. It was theft dressed as ambition. She opened her desk drawer, the metallic scrape slicing through the tense air. From within, she pulled a leather-bound folder, its corners worn, its papers yellowed. She laid the original founding documents beside the forgeries. Time itself testified for her, faded ink against freshly drawn lies. Claire crossed her arms, tilting her chin with impatience. "Mom, stop dramatizing. The world doesn't care about old paperwork. They care about progress." "About me," Ryan chuckled, enjoying his supporting role. "You've had your run, let the torch pass. Nobody wants to deal with outdated leadership." The room smelled of ink, paper, and betrayal. Diane stared at them both, her silence a wall taller than anything her words could build. Finally, she turned the forged documents toward Marta. "These don't match," Marta muttered, shaking her head. "Not even close." Diane's jaw tightened. Her office, the place where her husband's laughter had once echoed during late nights, where victory toasts had been made over every expansion, now felt tainted. The air was heavy, bitter. She rose from her chair, tucking both sets of documents into a neat stack. "I'll have Richard take a look," she said coolly. She didn't wait for their response. Locking her drawer, she brushed past Claire and Ryan, her heels firm, deliberate. Later that afternoon, Richard Evans's office smelled faintly of leather and stale coffee. Papers covered his desk, but his focus was absolute as he examined both the authentic and the forged. Diane sat across from him, her back straight, her hands laced tightly in her lap. Marta perched beside her, watchful and tense. Richard leaned under the glow of his desk lamp, tracing the signature with his thumb, then glancing at the next. His silence stretched, each second ratcheting the pressure higher. Finally, he set the forged page down with precision, his expression carved from stone. "She forged your signature," he said. The words cut through the room like steel. And for the first time that day, Diane allowed herself a smile, thin, cold, and promising retribution. Diane kept her gaze locked on the pages between them, her pulse thudding in her ears. All the battles she had fought to protect her company, from competitors, from economic downturns, from opportunistic suppliers, suddenly felt small compared to the war her own daughter had declared. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his tone razor sharp. "This isn't sloppy, Diane, it's deliberate. A full transfer of majority ownership, signed under your name. If she pushed this through the registry, you'd be listed as the one who gave up control." Marta let out a low whistle, tapping the edge of the forged document. "She's gutsy. I'll give her that. But guts and fraud are two different currencies." Diane's hand hovered over the complaint form. Richard slid across the desk. Her signature had always symbolized creation, growth, deals struck in good faith. Now, for the first time, she signed to defend herself against her own blood. The pen's scratch across the page felt heavier than any she'd ever made. That evening, Diane filed the complaint with the Illinois Secretary of State's Business Registry. Each keystroke echoing like a hammer striking iron. Her name would not be erased by counterfeit ink. When she returned to the office the next morning, Claire was waiting. She leaned against Diane's desk, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "You can file whatever you want. No one cares. I run the place now." Her laughter rang in the room, hollow and triumphant. Ryan stood at the window, checking his watch like a man too busy to involve himself. His silence was endorsement enough. Diane didn't answer. Silence had become her most effective shield. Later, in the quiet back corner of the office, Marta unfolded her laptop and set up at Diane's old conference table. If she's bold enough to forge signatures, she's bold enough to bleed the accounts. Let's see what she's been up to. The rhythmic clack of Marta's typing filled the room, broken only by the occasional hum of the coffee maker sputtering in the background. She pulled up vendor payments, scrolling through spreadsheets with an accountant's instinct sharpened by decades. Marta frowned, her finger pausing above the trackpad. "This vendor here, Midwest Print Solutions, supposedly supplying toner. But Diane, you've been using a contract with United Stationers for years. Why the sudden switch?" She clicked deeper. Payment after payment, amounts swelling into the tens of thousands, all to vendors Diane had never heard of. The smell of burnt coffee drifted from the pot, acrid, matching the bitterness swelling in Diane's chest. "She's building ghosts," Marta muttered. "Fake suppliers, money out, nothing back." Diane leaned closer, her voice low but firm. "She's bleeding it dry." The weight of the realization settled on them both. This wasn't just about ego or legacy. It was theft, systematic, calculated, and dressed in the language of business. Marta kept scrolling, her expression tightening with every new line. "Hold on. This isn't vendor payments. These are personal charges." She angled the screen toward Diane. "Airline tickets, first class to Miami. Luxury hotels in New York. A brand new SUV lease. Designer handbags purchased at Bloomingdale's. One receipt even listed a diamond bracelet. 6 figures alone." The conference room seemed to shrink, the fluorescent lights buzzing harshly overhead. Marta sat back, jaw tight. She's using the company card as her personal wallet. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more. Diane pressed her hand against the table, steadying herself. The company she had built through sweat and sacrifice was being gutted, not by an outsider, but by her own daughter. Betrayal, sharp as glass, cut through her chest, but beneath it, something colder stirred. Resolve. Her silence broke, her voice steady but laced with steel. "She thinks she can bury me under her name, but she's burying herself under debt." Marta's eyes flicked back to the glowing screen, scrolling further. Her breath caught. "Diane, you need to see this." The spreadsheet revealed another charge. This one astronomical. A single purchase, hidden among smaller transactions, nearly $150,000 on the company card. Not for supplies, not for services, for personal luxury. The betrayal had a number now, and it was 6 figures deep. Stacks of receipts spilled across the conference table like the aftermath of a storm. Marta laid them out one by one, her movements methodical, her frown deepening with every fresh piece of evidence. Airline tickets with embossed logos, glossy credit card slips from boutiques on Michigan Avenue, leases for a luxury SUV still sparkling on the showroom floor. The trail was undeniable, every charge pulsing like a neon sign that read stolen. Diane hovered over the documents, her fingers brushing the edges as if she could feel the weight of each betrayal. The smell of toner from the copier lingered in the room, sharp and acrid, clashing with the sickly sweet scent of Claire's perfume, still hanging faintly in the air from her earlier visit. Marta exhaled, sliding over a receipt for a handbag that cost more than an employee's yearly salary. She isn't even hiding it, Diane. This isn't sloppy bookkeeping, it's indulgence. Brazen, reckless. Diane didn't reply. Instead, she pulled a leather portfolio from her drawer, carefully placing the receipts inside. The dossier was growing. Signed contracts, forged transfers, and now this web of financial theft. Each page was another nail hammered into Claire's facade. Richard, on speakerphone, broke the silence with his gravelly voice. Don't tip your hand yet. Let her sink deeper before we strike. Judges like evidence stacked tall and irrefutable. Marta grimaced. You're telling her to watch her daughter torch the business in the meantime. Sometimes, Richard replied, his tone edged with ice. The fire has to spread far enough before the fire marshal steps in. Trust me, when we hit, it'll stick. Diane closed the portfolio with a snap. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She had learned long ago that the sharpest knives were the ones unsheathed at the right moment. That weekend she attended the Chamber of Commerce dinner, an event she had once hosted proudly with her husband. Now she walked in under the shadow of her daughter's ambition. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, polished floors reflecting the swirl of gowns and tuxedos. The scent of roasted beef and expensive wine filled the air. Claire, radiant in a sequined dress, took center stage at the head table. Raising her glass, she smiled for the crowd. New era, new leadership, she declared, her voice carrying across the hall. Laughter and polite applause followed, though a few wary glances flickered through the audience. From the corner, Ryan nursed his drink, smirking like a man basking in borrowed spotlight. His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Diane with a glint of triumph before sliding away. Diane stood among the crowd, her posture impeccable, her face unreadable. She lifted her glass, clinking it softly against Marta's. The sound was delicate, almost fragile, but her silence thundered louder than applause. Let Claire revel in the performance. Every show ends when the curtain falls. As the evening wound down, Diane returned home, the city lights flickering across her windshield. Chicago hummed outside her window, restless and alive, but her home felt heavy with stillness. She set the portfolio on her desk, its weight almost gravitational now. The next morning the mail arrived. Diane slid open a plain white envelope, expecting another invoice or marketing flyer. Instead, bold black letters stared back at her. Notice of unpaid corporate taxes. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't just luxury spending anymore, it was criminal negligence. Claire wasn't just bleeding the company, she was starving it to death. Line after line confirmed what she had feared since Marta's discovery. Payroll taxes had gone unpaid for months, not delayed, not misfiled, ignored. Diane leaned back in her chair, the creak of the leather loud in the silence of her office. Outside, the winter streets of Chicago moved briskly, traffic horns and slushing tires faint through the glass. But inside, the world narrowed to numbers printed in sharp serif type. Unpaid balances, penalties, threats of federal enforcement. Marta sat across from her, reading over Diane's shoulder. Her jaw tightened, the accountant in her too disciplined to overreact, but even she couldn't hide the tremor of anger in her voice. This isn't sloppy management anymore. This is criminal territory. The words settled like a stone in Diane's chest. Criminal. Her daughter hadn't just gambled with handbags and vacations. She had crossed into territory where federal judges and prison walls lived. Richard, reached by phone, was blunt as always. Don't fix it. Document it. Every letter, every penalty, every dollar missing, catalog it all. If you pay it, she'll skate free. If you let it stand, it's evidence. Diane pressed her lips together. For decades, she had been the kind of business owner who paid invoices early, who delivered checks with her husband's firm handshake. To ignore bills, taxes no less, was against every instinct she had. But Richard's voice was iron. We don't save her from herself. We let the government weigh her actions. So Diane began collecting. She spread each IRS letter across the desk, snapping photographs with her phone. One by one, the paper smelled faintly of dust and toner, but to her it carried the acrid scent of betrayal. Every envelope was another bruise against the company's integrity, but together they became a ledger of evidence. While Diane was building her archive of proof, Claire was building an empire of appearances. Marta slid her phone across the desk one afternoon, Instagram glowing on the screen. Claire posed in front of a new SUV, champagne flute in hand, captioned, "Work hard, reward harder. #CEO life." Another post showed her draped in jewelry, smiling wide under the chandelier of a Gold Coast restaurant. Each photo was carefully lit, staged, dripping with the arrogance of someone who believed money was endless and consequences fictional. Does she not realize this is public? Marta muttered, shaking her head. She doesn't care, Diane replied evenly. She thinks the image is stronger than the truth. If Claire flaunted, Ryan amplified. At a cocktail mixer Diane reluctantly attended, she overheard him boasting to a circle of acquaintances. His voice carried, thick with whiskey. We're running the company now. Diane's old-fashioned ways couldn't keep up. But Claire and we've modernized everything. We've got investors lining up. The men nodded politely, though Diane caught the flicker of skepticism in their eyes. She sipped her water in silence, her gaze meeting Marta's across the room. The urge to correct him, to drag the truth into the light, simmered like hot coal on her tongue. But she didn't. Not yet. Richard's warning echoed, "Let her sink deeper before we strike." Back in her office, Diane continued her quiet ritual, photographing letters, filing copies, updating the growing dossier. Each night she left the building under the glow of the street lamps, her portfolio heavier, her silence sharper. Claire mistook it for retreat. Ryan mistook it for surrender. Both would learn the truth in time. A week later, Diane met Richard in his law office. The room smelled of polished oak and leather-bound law books. His desk an orderly battlefield of briefs and contracts. He flipped through the photographs Diane had taken, his brow lifting slightly with each page. "She's not just reckless," he said at last. "She's radioactive. Vendors will pull back when they see this. Banks too. It's not just your name on the line anymore, it's hers, and she doesn't even know it." Diane folded her hands on the table, her voice measured. "Then it's time someone else did." Richard tapped the stack of evidence into order, slid it into a manila folder and rose. The motion was calm, practiced, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "I'll file a formal creditor alert. Once it's in motion, the system won't stop. Bankruptcy will be on the table, whether she realizes it or not." Diane exhaled slowly, the decision solidifying around her like steel. Claire had chosen handbags over payroll, champagne over taxes. Now the consequences would arrive, not with warning, but with a summons. And Diane Mercer would be ready. The morning Diane gave Richard her quiet nod of approval, a chain reaction began. He filed the creditor alert with the precision of a surgeon making the first cut. Once entered into the system, it traveled faster than whispers in a small town. Emails, phone calls, red flag notifications, pinging every vendor, bank, and contractor tied to Mercer Office Supply. By mid-afternoon, The fallout was already visible. A delivery truck that usually backed into the loading dock every Tuesday didn't arrive. A vendor who had supplied them for 20 years abruptly canceled their next order. Phones in the front office rang with clipped, tense voices on the other end. "We'll need prepayment going forward. We've put your account on hold. We can't extend further credit." Diane sat in her office, coffee in hand, her posture as calm as if she were watching a thunderstorm from behind glass. The bitter aroma curled upward, comforting, steadying. She had survived worse storms: her husband's sudden death, recessions that wiped out competitors. This one, however, wasn't a natural disaster. It was engineered, precise, and aimed directly at the daughter who thought she could bury her. Across the hall, employees whispered in tight clusters. Paychecks had bounced, direct deposits delayed. Rumors slithered through the cubicles. Is the company broke? Is Diane coming back? What did Claire do? The air buzzed with unease, and Claire, for all her posturing, couldn't stop it. Marta entered Diane's office with a half smile, dropping into the chair opposite her. "You iced her supply chain. She can't bluff her way through missing toner and unpaid invoices. Every crack is showing at once." Diane sipped her coffee. "Good. Let the cracks widen." The next day the eruption came. Claire stormed through the office, heels stabbing against the tile, Ryan trailing behind like a shadow, desperate not to be noticed. "Fix this," she hissed at him loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Her cheeks were flushed crimson, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Ryan raised his palms, defensive. "I told you I don't handle the books. You wanted the control, remember? Investors don't care about the little stuff. They want confidence. Confidence doesn't get shipments delivered." Claire spat, waving a printout of canceled orders. "You're supposed to back me up. You're supposed to help." Ryan's shrug was the final insult. "I married a businesswoman, Claire. Act like one." The words landed like a slap, and for the first time, employees didn't bother hiding their smirks as they watched Claire unravel. The glamorous CEO image she'd been broadcasting began to crumble in real time, and Diane, seated in her office with the door cracked open, allowed herself the smallest, coldest smile. By the week's end, the office felt like a sinking ship. Vendors refused to deliver without cash in hand. Clients grew uneasy, emails turning from polite inquiries to pointed demands. The glossy illusion Claire had flaunted at chamber dinners dissolved, leaving only chaos and unanswered phones. And then silence. A silence thicker than any rumor. Diane found it waiting on her desk in the form of a thick envelope stamped with federal insignia. She slid it open carefully, Marta leaning in beside her. Inside was a summons, formal, unmistakable. Bankruptcy court had been set in motion. Diane exhaled slowly, setting the papers down as if they were nothing more than another invoice, though her pulse beat steady in her throat. Claire had tried to erase her name with ink. Now Diane had replaced hers with the one thing Claire could never outshine, the gavel of a court of law. The war was no longer private. It was official. The summons had arrived like a blade, sharp and final, but to Diane, it wasn't an end, it was a stage. And if Claire thought she'd scripted the play, she was about to learn who held the pen. Richard's office became their war room. The smell of stale coffee lingered, stacks of files towering like walls around them. Diane sat at the head of the long oak table, sleeves rolled, her reading glasses perched low. One by one, she slid folders across the table. Marta, ever meticulous, cataloged each receipts, bank statements, letters from the IRS, canceled vendor contracts. She labeled, cross-referenced, color-coded, her fingers moving with the certainty of a woman who'd spent decades making order out of chaos. "This," Marta said, sliding a pile across to Richard, "is the pattern. Not one mistake, not oversight, deliberate, repeated theft." Richard flipped through the papers, his expression unreadable. Finally he tapped the table. "Courts like trails. You've built one so long and so damning, it'll hang her twice over." The company, meanwhile, was unraveling in Claire's hands. Employees who once greeted her with forced enthusiasm now avoided her gaze. Whispers swirled in hallways. How Diane still came to the office daily, how she worked with Richard, how vendors trusted her more than Claire. Loyalty shifted quietly, invisibly, the way rivers carve new paths without sound. Claire reacted with desperation. To save money, she began laying off staff. Entire departments gutted in a single morning, desks emptied, computers unplugged, the once busy hum of the office thinning into uneasy silence. In the break room, Diane overheard one of the junior clerks whisper, "She's killing us to save herself." Another added, "If Diane was in charge, this wouldn't be happening." Their voices dropped to hushed tones when Claire stormed past, Ryan in tow, his face blank, his eyes fixed anywhere but hers. That night, Diane found Marta hunched over a ledger at the kitchen table of her condo, receipts spread wide like cards in a poker game. Marta rubbed her temples, exhausted but relentless. "Every dollar tells a story," she muttered. "And Claire's written a novel of theft." Diane rested a hand on her friend's shoulder. "Then we'll read it to the judge." The next morning, Richard called a meeting in his office. The city buzzed outside, sirens, honking, the low roar of traffic, but inside the air was thick with anticipation. Richard set down his pen, eyes narrowing on Diane. "Tomorrow we face the creditors. They'll want to know who's to blame. Claire will spin, Ryan will shrug. Your job is simpler. Sit tall, stay silent, let the evidence speak." Diane nodded, her voice firm. "I've lived with integrity for 30 years. I don't need to prove it. I just need to show it." Richard smirked faintly, a flash of admiration. "Exactly." When the day came, the courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, sterile, severe. Judge Franklin Boyd presided with an air of impatience, his gavel tapping once to still the room. Claire sat at the front, her dress immaculate, her expression painted with false confidence. Ryan sat beside her, already sweating under the fluorescent lights. Diane sat with Richard and Marta behind her, portfolio in hand, every page in its place. The murmur of creditors filled the room, vendors, banks, employees who hadn't seen their paychecks. Judge Boyd's voice cut through the din, deep and unyielding. "Before we proceed, we must establish the primary creditor in this case, the individual most invested in the financial outcome of Mercer Office Supply." Claire leaned forward, expecting her name to follow. Ryan smirked, his leg bouncing under the table, but the judge's gaze shifted to Diane. "Mrs. Mercer, as founder and documented majority stakeholder, the court recognizes you as the primary creditor." The room froze. Claire's painted smile faltered, her mouth parting in disbelief. Ryan's smirk evaporated. Diane folded her hands in her lap, serene, while Marta leaned forward and whispered with satisfaction, "The stage is yours now." The conference room buzzed with tension before the meeting even began. Long polished wood stretched from end to end, lined with stiff-backed chairs already filled with angry faces, vendors, bankers, employees who hadn't seen paychecks in weeks. Their papers rustled like restless wings, their eyes fixed on the woman at the head of the table, Claire. She smoothed the lapels of her blazer, pretending calm, but her knuckles whitened against the binder she clutched. Beside her, Ryan fidgeted, avoiding eye contact, his tie slightly askew. The fluorescent lights above hummed, harsh and unforgiving, making sweat gleam on his forehead. Judge Boyd presided at the far end, stern as stone. "This meeting is to allow creditors to question the debtor about financial standing. Speak clearly. Speak honestly." The first vendor stood, his voice tight with fury. "We've supplied your company for 18 years, and now you expect us to eat losses because you couldn't manage payroll. You owe us $70,000. Where's our money?" Claire straightened, forcing a smile that cracked at the edges. "There have been temporary cash flow issues. The business is restructuring. Once investors, the man snapped, slapping a stack of invoices onto the table. "We don't take IOUs on promises. We take checks, and yours bounce." Murmurs spread around the table, chairs creaking as others leaned forward. The smell of burnt coffee from a neglected pot in the corner hung heavy, souring the air. Another voice rose, this time from a former employee, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. My paycheck bounced twice. I couldn't pay rent. You smiled at chamber dinners, while I had to borrow from my parents just to keep the lights on. Her words shook the room more than any ledger could. Claire's veneer slipped. She stammered, "I wasn't aware." Marta leaned close to Diane, her whisper sharp, "Tick-tock." Diane remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She said nothing, offered nothing. Silence was her armor, and every angry testimony was another blade striking her daughter instead. Ryan finally spoke, his voice slick but unsteady. "Let's not dramatize. Businesses restructure all the time. Risk is part of risk," a banker interrupted, his face red. "Risk isn't payroll theft. Risk isn't unpaid taxes. You've torched your credibility." The table erupted into overlapping voices. Anger demands disbelief. Claire raised her hands, trying to calm the storm. "Please, if you'll just allow me time. Time doesn't pay debts." Someone spat from the back. Judge Boyd's gavel struck the table once, the crack silencing the room. He turned his gaze toward Richard, who had been sitting quietly with a thick folder before him, his expression patient, calculating. "Mr. Evans," the judge said, "you indicated you have evidence regarding ownership and conduct." Richard stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. He slid the folder open, pulling free a stack of documents. His voice carried steady, unhurried, as if each word was a nail sealing a coffin. "These," he said, laying them on the table for all to see, "are stock transfer documents, signed under Mrs. Mercer's name. Except, as you'll notice, the signature isn't hers." The air seemed to freeze. Chairs stilled, whispers died. Claire's face drained of color, her hand tightening around her binder until the leather squeaked. Richard placed the forged contracts in front of Judge Boyd. "This is fraud. And it goes beyond bounced checks." Judge Boyd adjusted his glasses, lifting the stack of papers Richard had placed before him. The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence, the kind where even the shuffle of a shoe or the cough of a bystander felt intrusive. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, illuminating the judge's sharp profile as he traced his finger along the ink of Diane's stolen signature. He looked up, eyes steady and cutting. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, voice carrying like a hammer striking steel, "would you care to explain why your mother's name appears on a transfer she did not sign?" Claire's breath hitched. The confidence she had wielded so freely, the posture, the smirk, the carefully rehearsed tone, evaporated in a blink. Her face drained, leaving only pale defiance. "That's not, those papers must have been mixed up." Her voice cracked at the edges, flimsy and transparent. Richard interjected smoothly, laying another document on the table. "Not mixed up, Your Honor. Forged. Here's a comparison of Mrs. Mercer's authentic signature from the original founding documents. Same curves, same spacing, except the forgery is too clean, too perfect. Signatures don't repeat with such precision. Machines do." The words landed with lethal precision. Gasps rustled through the creditors, seated around the room. One vendor whispered to another, the phrase "forged signature" spreading like wildfire. Ryan shifted in his seat, sweat purling at his temple. He tugged at his collar, his voice wobbling when he finally spoke. "I had nothing to do with this. Claire handled everything. I just trusted her." His palms spread wide as if the gesture could absolve him. The judge's gaze sharpened. "You're listed as co-signer on several of these accounts, Mr. Sutton. Trust does not erase responsibility." Ryan blanched, shrinking back into his chair. Diane sat still, hands folded neatly, eyes fixed on her daughter. She hadn't spoken through most of the meeting, but now, in the thick hush, her voice cut through with icy clarity. "You tried to erase me, Claire. But in the process, you erased yourself." Her words weren't shouted. They were delivered evenly, almost quietly, yet they struck harder than any raised voice could. Claire pushed back from the table suddenly, the chair legs screeching across the floor. "This is ridiculous. You're all turning against me because she can't let go of the past." Her finger stabbed the air toward Diane, her voice shrill. She's orchestrating this. She's jealous. Judge Boyd's gavel cracked once, silencing the eruption. His expression remained carved in stone. Enough. This court does not operate on jealousy or sentiment. It operates on law. And the law says forgery is fraud. The final word echoed like thunder. Fraud. It was no longer whispers in a hallway. No longer suspicion traded over late-night coffees with Marta. It was official. The judge stacked the documents, his voice crisp. In addition to bankruptcy proceedings, this court is referring matters of forgery and fraud to federal investigators. Mrs. Sutton, your conduct goes beyond mismanagement. It is criminal. The room seemed to shrink around Claire. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted toward Ryan, searching for backup. But he looked away, shame heavy in his posture. Marta leaned forward slightly, whispering to Diane, "She's unraveling." Diane didn't answer. She simply watched as her daughter's empire of arrogance collapsed brick by brick. Claire shoved her papers into her bag with frantic hands, her movements jerky, uncontrolled. "This isn't over," she hissed, before storming out of the room. The door slammed behind her, the sound reverberating like a final note of a requiem. Silence lingered. The creditors exchanged glances, some smug, others grim. Diane exhaled slowly, her victory not triumphant but steady, measured. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, not once. Truth had done the shouting for her. Richard gathered the remaining documents, sliding them neatly into his folder. "The court just did half our work for us," he said under his breath. But the victory wasn't private for long. That evening, headlines flashed across Chicago's news outlets, bold letters impossible to ignore. Mercer business rocked by forgery, fraud scandal. The story spread within hours, on local broadcasts, in printed papers, on social media. What Claire had once craved, her name on every marquee, every business card, was now realized, but not in the way she had imagined. Her name wasn't etched in triumph. It was plastered in disgrace. The morning after the courtroom eruption, the newsstands told a story Claire could not control. Diane walked past a vendor on Michigan Avenue and froze. There it was. Claire's name splashed in block letters above the fold: Mercer, heiress accused of forgery, fraud. The paper's ink smelled sharp, almost metallic, and the photo beneath the headline was damning. Claire storming out of court, her face twisted in panic. She had wanted her name lit up in gold letters across the skyline. Instead, it was printed in black as evidence of disgrace. By noon, the story had spread beyond the papers. Local news anchors dissected her every move. On talk radio, callers argued whether she was arrogant or simply foolish. Online, hashtags with her name trended alongside words like fraud and embezzlement. Claire's curated world of luxury handbags and champagne glasses had been replaced with mugshot-style screenshots and ridicule. Marta sat across from Diane in the office, scrolling through the flood of coverage on her phone. It's everywhere, every channel, every feed. She wanted a spotlight, and now it's burning her alive. Diane didn't look up from her paperwork. Her voice was calm, steady. Good. Maybe now the people she hurt will know she can't hide behind glitter. The fallout came fast. The Chamber of Commerce, once Claire's stage for grand speeches and sparkling toasts, called an emergency board meeting. Within hours, her membership was revoked. The official statement was clipped and merciless. "Integrity is the foundation of our community. Fraud has no place here." When the announcement hit the press, Diane's phone lit with messages from longtime colleagues. Some congratulated her. Others simply wrote, "Finally." Ryan, meanwhile, retreated into silence. The man who had once bragged loudly about their empire now ducked invitations, avoided cocktail mixers, and canceled meetings. At a cafe near the Loop, Diane overheard whispers from two associates. "Ryan Sutton. Haven't seen him in weeks. Hiding, I'd bet." Diane allowed herself a private smile. The man who had smirked at her downfall now shrank from the very spotlight he once chased. But for Diane there was no retreat. She returned to the office, her presence a quiet reassurance to the employees who had endured Claire's chaos. In the break room, faces turned to her with cautious relief. She gathered them together, speaking simply, "I know the last months have been unstable. You've been lied to, and you've carried the weight of someone else's mistakes, but this company was built on honesty, and it will return to it. Stay steady. The storm is almost over." The words weren't flashy, but they landed. Shoulders eased. Conversations resumed. A hum of renewed energy threaded through the halls. Later in her office, Marta placed another newspaper on the desk. This one bore a column praising Diane's composure. While her daughter crumbles under scandal, Diane Mercer remains a figure of resilience. The name Mercer, once threatened, now rings cleaner than ever. Marta chuckled. "Your name's cleaner than ever." Diane looked up from the article, her voice cool but edged with finality. "And hers is dirt." The satisfaction was real, but it was tempered by what came next. That afternoon, Richard arrived with new papers in hand, his expression sober. He set them down carefully on her desk. "The judge has reviewed the evidence. A liquidation hearing is scheduled." Diane placed her palm flat on the document, the weight of it steady beneath her hand. Claire had wanted her name on the company sign. Instead, her name would now be read in the bankruptcy court's docket. The courtroom air was sharp with tension, a faint tang of polish and paper lingering as Judge Boyd read the order. His voice was even, but the words landed like hammer strikes. "The court hereby authorizes liquidation of all non-exempt assets belonging to Claire Mercer Sutton." Claire's face drained, her perfectly applied lipstick trembling at the edges. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table as though the wood might save her. "Your Honor, please, those assets aren't their personal. They're mine." Boyd didn't even glance up. "They were purchased with company funds. The distinction doesn't exist." The gavel cracked once, and with it the life Claire had flaunted began to fracture. Within days, her luxury SUV was hauled from the condo garage, its polished frame reflecting the flash of cameras as neighbors whispered. Jewelry she had displayed on Instagram vanished into velvet-lined cases held by court-appointed appraisers. Designer handbags, once perched proudly on her arm, were tagged with numbers like evidence in a crime scene. Even the downtown condo, its sleek glass walls and curated art, was marked for sale. Diane watched it all unfold from a quiet distance. Each seizure was documented, each item catalogued in ledgers that replaced Claire's fantasy with reality. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. The empire claimed to run had become nothing more than a garage sale for creditors. The day of testimony arrived. Claire stood before the court, her voice cracking under the fluorescent lights. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was trying to build something, trying to honor the family name." Her tears smeared her mascara, streaking down her face in chaotic lines. "Please, if you give me a chance, I can fix it." Diane sat straight-backed in her chair, hands folded neatly. When called, she stepped forward with calm precision, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She raised her right hand, swore her oath, and faced the room. Her voice carried steady, clear. "I built this company with integrity. With my husband, we worked day and night to make sure every bill was paid, every employee respected, every client served. My daughter did not honor that legacy. She exploited it. These assets aren't hers. They were stolen through deception. And now justice is being done." A murmur swept the courtroom. Employees seated in the gallery nodded. Some even clapped quietly before the bailiff stilled them. Marta leaned over and whispered with grim satisfaction, "Justice wears balance sheets." Claire's shoulders collapsed, her sobs echoing against the wooden walls. Ryan sat 2 chairs down, silent, his face blank with practiced detachment. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't even look at her. When the judge adjourned, Diane exited with Marta at her side. The courthouse smelled faintly of rain from the storm outside, and the marble floor echoed with footsteps as people filed out. For a moment, Diane breathed freely, the weight of months of silence and preparation easing from her chest. But the reprieve didn't last. The rain outside had thinned to a mist, but Claire's fury burned hot enough to steam the air between them. She stood in the courthouse steps' shadow, her eyes wild, hair clinging in damp strands against her cheeks. Her voice split the gray Chicago afternoon like a siren. "You ruined me," she screamed, every syllable ragged echoing against the marble columns. Her hands shook, not from cold but from rage, fingers curling as though she could claw back everything she had lost. Diane did not flinch. Months of silence, restraint, and preparation had carved her into steel. She let the pause linger until even the pigeons perched on the ledge seemed to hold still. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, her words razor-sharp. "No," Diane said, her gaze steady. "You ruined yourself." The courthouse plaza stilled. A few lingering employees and reporters, people who had followed the trial's every turn, stopped mid-stride. Their eyes flicked from mother to daughter, weighing truth against tantrum. Slowly, deliberately, a man in a vendor's jacket nodded. Then another. Their quiet agreement spread like a current until Claire stood surrounded by silent judgment. She could not shout down. Claire's face twisted, but her words faltered. She glanced at Ryan, expecting his defense, his usual smirk to buffer her collapse. But Ryan had already begun to retreat. His hands jammed deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if hoping invisibility might save him. Without a word he turned, slipping into the crowd moving down State Street. He didn't look back. "Ryan," Claire called after him, desperation cracking her voice, but he didn't stop. The sound of his footsteps faded into the city's hum, taxi horns, distant train brakes, the murmur of pedestrians. Claire's scream dissolved into silence, leaving her exposed, abandoned. Marta stepped closer to Diane, her umbrella shielding them both from the drizzle. Her voice was low, meant only for Diane's ear. "That's checkmate. She can scream all she wants. The board is already cleared." Diane gave a single nod, not triumph but acknowledgement. She had learned long ago that true victories didn't require fireworks. They required endurance. Her heels clicked softly against the wet pavement as she stepped past her daughter. Claire staggered, as if struck by the absence of attention, the absence of power. Diane did not look back. She had nothing left to take from the woman who had already stripped herself bare. As she crossed the plaza, a clerk from Judge Boyd's office hurried through the revolving courthouse doors, a manila envelope in hand. "Mrs. Mercer," he called, his breath clouding in the damp air. She turned, calm, the drizzle catching in her silver hair. He handed her the sealed document. "The court has set the date for final ruling. You'll want to prepare. It will close the case." Diane accepted the envelope with both hands. The paper was cool, the seal crisp beneath her fingertips. Behind her, Claire's sobs echoed faintly, mingling with the shuffle of footsteps on wet stone. Diane didn't break stride as she tucked the fifth envelope beneath her arm. The war had been loud headlines, accusations, courtrooms filled with venom, but the end would be decided in silence, by ink on paper, by the authority of a gavel. And Diane, tall and unshaken, walked toward it with the certainty of a woman who had already won. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that carried weight, the kind that pressed on shoulders and lungs. The oak benches creaked as creditors settled into place, papers rustled, and the faint smell of polish and damp coats filled the air. At the front, Judge Boyd adjusted his glasses, the gavel resting within reach like a weapon of finality. Diane sat calmly at the petitioner's table, her portfolio closed and neat before her. Months of preparation, nights of sleepless cataloging, all of it came down to this moment. Marta sat at her side, hands folded tightly, while Richard leaned back with the composed patience of a man who already knew the outcome. Across the aisle, Claire looked smaller than she had ever been. Her once sharp wardrobe was wrinkled, her hair hastily pinned, her face pale beneath courtroom lights. No sequined dresses, no staged confidence, just a woman cornered by her own choices. The chair beside her was empty. Ryan hadn't shown. His absence spoke louder than any testimony. Judge Boyd's voice rang out, firm and deliberate. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented, including documented instances of forgery, embezzlement and gross mismanagement of Mercer Office Supply. The findings are clear. The words reverberated through the chamber like the opening notes of a requiem. Claire's knuckles tightened around the edge of the table until her nails whitened. Bankruptcy is hereby finalized, Boyd continued. All personal and business assets seized under order will be liquidated to satisfy creditors. Furthermore, Claire Mercer Sutton is barred from serving as owner or director of any registered business within the state of Illinois for the next 15 years. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Claire's head dropped, her hair spilling forward to hide her face. A low gasp escaped her lips, part sob, part denial. The woman who had craved her name in lights now had it etched permanently in shame. Boyd's gaze shifted. As for the status of creditors, the court recognizes Mrs. Diane Mercer as the primary and controlling creditor of record. Effective immediately, Mrs. Mercer holds authority over the settlement of remaining assets tied to Mercer Office Supply. A quiet murmur rippled across the room, relief from employees, satisfaction from vendors, curiosity from the press seated in the back. Diane allowed herself a single breath, slow and steady, before straightening in her seat. The company wasn't hers in name alone anymore, it was hers again in truth. Beside her, Marta whispered with a dry chuckle, "She got bankruptcy for her birthday." Diane's lips curved into the faintest smile, "And I got my name back." The courtroom remained hushed, even as people began to shuffle papers and rise. Some glanced toward Diane with respect, others with gratitude. No one looked at Claire. She sat hollow, unmoving, a woman unspooled. Diane stood, smoothing her jacket, and extended her arm to Marta. Together they walked past Claire without a word. The faint scent of Claire's perfume, once sharp and commanding, now smelled cloying, desperate, an echo of a power that no longer existed. Out in the corridor, flashes from cameras erupted as reporters pressed forward, questions tumbling over one another. "Mrs. Mercer, how does it feel to reclaim your company? Do you believe justice was served?" Diane kept walking, her silence answering louder than any prepared quote. Richard caught up to her outside the courthouse steps, his leather briefcase swinging at his side. "You handled it perfectly," he said. "Now rebuild. The stage is yours." Diane lifted her face to the gray sky, inhaling deeply as the cold air filled her lungs. For the first time in months, her chest felt light. Then Marta's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and arched an eyebrow before handing it to Diane. A message glowed bold against the glass. "The Chicago Chamber of Commerce cordially invites Mrs. Diane Mercer to the annual dinner." Diane read it twice, her lips curving. The same event where Claire had once declared a new era would now be hers to reclaim. The ballroom smelled of polish and champagne, the chandeliers above scattering light across gilded mirrors and velvet drapes. It was the same Chamber of Commerce dinner, where Claire had once toasted to a new era. Diane paused at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on Marta's arm. For a moment she remembered that night. Claire's smug grin, Ryan's lazy smirk, the applause that had felt like betrayal. Tonight the air held a different charge. Conversations hushed. As she stepped into the room, heads turned, eyes widening, forks stilled midair. Then a wave of applause began, tentative at first, then swelling until the entire hall rang with it. Diane, who had once been treated as a relic of the past, was now greeted as the embodiment of endurance. Marta squeezed her hand, whispering with a grin, "They see you now." Richard intercepted them near the stage, his tux crisp, his smile uncharacteristically warm. He raised his voice so it carried over the applause. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to reintroduce the true Mercer legacy, Mrs. Diane Mercer." The room erupted again. Glasses clinked, some guests rising to their feet. Diane inclined her head with quiet grace, letting the applause wash over her without basking in it. This was not vanity. This was vindication. As she reached the podium, the soft weight of every gaze settled on her shoulders. The microphone hummed faintly. Waiting. She placed her notes aside. Her words didn't need paper. "Integrity," she began. her voice clear, carrying easily across the hall, isn't glamorous. It doesn't sparkle like diamonds or shine on magazine covers. Integrity lives in the small choices, signing a check honestly, paying a worker on time, honoring the promise behind your name. My husband and I built Mercer Office Supply on those choices, and when integrity was stolen from this company, it nearly cost us everything. The room was silent, except for the clinking of ice in glasses. Faces leaned forward, listening. But here's the truth, she continued. Money comes and goes. Contracts shift. Reputations can be broken in a single headline. But integrity, when you fight for it, outlasts all of it. I stand here not because I was spared betrayal, but because I refused to let betrayal define me. This company, this legacy, was not built on handbags or fraud. It was built on honor, and that will outlive any scandal. A swell of applause rose again, louder, stronger. Marta's eyes glistened as she clapped, her smile wide and fierce. Richard nodded with satisfaction, his hand pressed briefly to Diane's shoulder in approval. When the ovation subsided, the chamber president took the microphone. His tone was firm, reverent. In recognition of her resilience, leadership, and integrity, the Chamber of Commerce formally reinstates Mrs. Diane Mercer as a member in good standing. And more than that, we honor her as a pillar of this city's business community. The declaration drew cheers. Waiters resumed pouring champagne, the room buzzing with renewed energy. Diane lifted her glass, not high, not boastful, but steady, meeting the eyes of the people who had doubted her. Marta leaned close, her voice low and certain. Full circle, Diane. You didn't just survive, you reclaimed it all. Diane's lips curved, and I did it without shouting. The truth spoke for itself. The music swelled again, the scent of roasted duck and sweet wine drifting through the air as the dinner resumed. Diane mingled with colleagues, who once whispered doubts, but now offered warm congratulations. Laughter rippled through the tables, glasses clinked, the night alive with celebration. And then stillness. As Diane exited the ballroom hours later, the cool night air brushed her face. The ornate doors closed behind her, muting the music and applause. Across the street, half shrouded in shadow, stood Claire. Her coat hung loosely, her posture slumped. The light from a street lamp caught her hollow expression. No cameras, no friends, no Ryan at her side. Just silence. People streamed past without recognition, without pause. For years Claire had clawed for attention. Now the city moved around her as if she were invisible. Diane stopped for a moment. Marta at her side, watching. Claire's eyes met hers across the distance. Desperation flickered, then something colder, resentment. Unbroken, unyielding. Diane turned away first. The chamber's music swelled faintly through the doors behind her, but the future belonged to her now, not to the daughter fading in the shadows. The storm had passed, and in its wake the building finally breathed again. No shouting, no panicked phone calls, no forged papers sliding across her desk like poison. Just the steady hum of printers, the soft click of keyboards, and the smell of fresh coffee curling through the halls. Diane sipped from her mug, the warmth seeping into her hands, and let the quiet crown her. The company was leaner now, smaller, but sharper. Claire's waste had been stripped away, leaving a core team that had survived because they believed in more than paychecks. They believed in her. Tasha at the front desk smiled each morning with renewed pride, greeting visitors with a brightness that hadn't existed during Claire's reign. Paul in accounting stopped her in the hall one afternoon, voice low but steady. I didn't know if I'd make rent some months. But you saved this place, Diane, and you saved us with it. She didn't answer with grand words, just a hand on his shoulder and a nod. For her, survival spoke louder than speeches. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, Marta arrived at 9 with a tote bag filled with folders and ledgers. She settled into the conference room, glasses perched low, her pen moving with surgical precision. Payrolls funded, vendors satisfied, taxes clean, she reported one morning, sliding the ledger across the table. The balance sheet finally looks like it belongs to a business again, not a casino. Diane allowed herself a smile. Justice wears balance sheets, she echoed, recalling Marta's words from months earlier. Their weekly ritual gave the company its rhythm back. Marta's laughter filled the office as often as the rustle of paper, and for the first time in years, Diane felt less like a lonely widow and more like a leader surrounded by allies. The outside world, meanwhile, closed in on Claire. Newspapers no longer chased her name. They buried it beneath updates about liquidation. Friends stopped calling. The chamber had erased her without ceremony, and social media mocked her with merciless precision. Bankrupt, ostracized, and invisible, her noise had finally gone silent. Ryan, ever the opportunist, cut his losses next. Diane read the news in the Tribune. Ryan Sutton files for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. She knew better. He was shedding Claire like a bad investment, already sniffing for another stage to stand on. For once, Diane felt no anger, only pity. At home, mornings were her favorite. She sat on the balcony with her coffee, the city alive beneath her horns, sirens, footsteps against pavement, but none of it reached her in the same way it used to. The chaos was theirs, the calm was hers. She flipped through the paper, found her name in a business column, praising her resilience, and folded it neatly beside her plate. No champagne, no vanity, just peace. One Thursday, as she closed her office for the evening, her assistant stepped in with an envelope. "This just came for you," she said, handing it over with a grin. The letter was crisp, the seal embossed with familiar weight. Diane unfolded it, her eyes scanning the lines. "The Chamber of Commerce invites you to mentor at our new program for young entrepreneurs." She leaned back in her chair, the hum of the office settling around her. Marta peeked in, eyebrows raised. "What is it?" Diane held up the letter, her voice calm but tinged with something new, anticipation. "Looks like they want me to teach the next generation how to survive." The quiet she had earned was not an ending, it was an opening. The Chamber's mentorship program launched in a sunlit hall downtown, the walls lined with portraits of business leaders past. But on this morning, every eye was on Diane. She stood at the podium, not with the stiff posture of survival, but with the ease of someone who had already weathered the storm and walked out unbroken. Around her sat a dozen young women, eager, nervous, notebooks ready. Some wore thrift store blazers, others came straight from service jobs with uniforms tucked into bags. Their eyes held the same hunger Diane had once carried when she and her husband sold pens door to door out of their trunk. She began simply. "You don't build a business with luck. You build it with grit, with honesty, and with enough stubbornness to keep standing when someone tries to knock you down." Her voice carried steady, the words rooted in the weight of experience. She didn't embellish her story, but she didn't soften it either. She told them about betrayal, about signatures stolen and trust broken, about the silence she held until the truth had no choice but to speak for itself. The women scribbled notes, nodding. One raised her hand shyly. "How do you know when to fight back?" Diane smiled faintly. "When someone mistakes your patience for weakness, that's when you sharpen your pen." Applause broke out, not polite but grateful. These weren't investors looking for sound bites. They were fighters looking for proof that survival could be turned into triumph. Weeks later, the chamber held another dinner, this time not for scandal or recovery, but for recognition. Diane sat at the front, Marta beside her, Richard across the table. The president of the chamber raised his glass. "Tonight we announce a new scholarship, the Mercer Grant, awarded annually to women entrepreneurs who demonstrate integrity and resilience, named for Diane Mercer, who reminded us all what those words mean." The crowd rose in applause. Marta clinked her glass against Diane's, her smile fierce and proud. "Mercer means strength again." Diane's reply was quiet but sharp enough to cut the air. "And bankruptcy means her name." Laughter rippled at the table, but Diane's gaze drifted past the champagne, past the speeches, past the weight of ceremony. Later that night, she walked the familiar street back to the office building. The sign out front glowed under the lamplight, "Mercer Office Supply." Her name, steady and unbroken, etched against the city's pulse. She paused, coffee cup in hand, watching her reflection in the glass. For decades that name had meant family, work, survival. Now it meant victory. Not the loud kind, but the lasting kind. Her daughter had tried to replace her name with hers. Diane had replaced hers with bankruptcy court. My daughter tried to replace my name with hers on the family business, so I replaced hers with bankruptcy court.